we're going to wrap up the problem that we've been looking at about our students on grades 4 through 6. Of course, asking whether good grades, popularity, or sports is the most important to them. So we've got our two-way table, and I've copied and pasted our null hypothesis and our alternative hypothesis. So remember from a couple videos ago, we talked about H naught. We said that grade level and most important factor are independent, meaning the outcome of one of those things does not tell us anything about the outcome of the other. They're completely unrelated. And then the alternative hypothesis, grade level and most important factor are dependent in some way, meaning there's some sort of relationship between those two things. From our previous problem, we also have our chi-square value up here of 1.3121, and we also have our p-value of 0.8593. So we're going to start off just by making our decision and interpreting our decision for this problem. We have an alpha of 0.05. So remember, we're comparing these two numbers, the p-value and our alpha. If the p-value is less than alpha, then we reject. So I always try and phrase it in that same way every time. I say, is the p-value less than alpha? And in this case, no, the p-value is not less than alpha, so that means that we will not reject H naught. So my decision then is to not reject the null hypothesis, H naught. So do not reject H naught is my decision, first of all. And then if I want to talk about the decision, I'm going to talk about the evidence in support of the alternative hypothesis. So if I didn't reject H naught, that means that there wasn't enough evidence to support the alternative hypothesis. So I would say there is not enough evidence to support that grade level. And most important factor, are dependent. And again, there's a lot of different ways you could phrase this. You could talk about they're associated if you wanted to talk about that or use that language. There's certainly more than one way you could phrase this. Remember what our p-value tells us. If I go back here and think about that p-value, this represents the probability that we get a sample as extreme as ours, which really means a sample quote-unquote like ours if the null hypothesis is true. So assuming this null hypothesis is true, the probability that we get a sample like ours is roughly 85.93%, which is awfully high. So it's not unlikely at all that we would get a sample that looks similar to this if the null hypothesis is true. So that's not really very much evidence at all for the alternative hypothesis. So that's why we will not reject the null hypothesis. We will continue to believe that that is true. So there's the first question. I'm going to follow that up with one other question here. It says, if we made an error, which type did we make? Type 1 or type 2? We talked about this way back in chapter 5. Remember our decision-making errors, and those are the same for all types of hypothesis tests. It doesn't matter whether we're doing a test for independence or a test for one proportion or a test for two proportion. These are always the same. So this says, if we made an error, what type did we make? We chose in this case to not reject H naught. So that means we're looking at the not rejecting H naught. In other words, we failed to reject H naught. And using this handy dandy little table right there, I can say, well, if we failed to reject H naught, one of two things is true. Either H naught is true. Yeah, H naught is true, in which case, hey, cool, that's awesome. That's great news. If H naught is true, then we made the right decision and we're good to go. But if the alternative hypothesis is true, then in this case, we've made a type 2 error. So if we made a mistake, and of course, there's no way for us to know at the end of this, we've made a type 2 error. So If we've made a mistake, we've made a type 2 error. But again, there is no way for us to know at the end of this. We just kind of have to trust the process and say, this is what is likely true. This is what is likely happening in this scenario.